Congressman Tim Griffin represents Arkansas's 2nd District as a Republican. Good morning.
Thank you. Good morning.
Thank you for being here.
Sure.
A first term in Congress.
That's right.
One of the issues you're working on right now is a proposal to eliminate the pension benefit offered to members of Congress.
That's
Why?
right. Well, I think that the broader issue that we need to be addressing is pensions for civil servants, for government employees, and I don't believe that we can get to that issue. I don't believe we have credibility on that issue unless we first address our own house. And I turned down my congressional pension. I took myself out of the system when I got here. But I feel like as a body, even though the amount of money represented by congressional pensions is a very, very small piece of the budget, I feel that before we can address the bigger piece of the budget, pensions for federal employees, we've got to deal with our own.
And you've come into Congress as a freshman. Was this something that you thought about before coming in? Was this a long-term held belief you had?
Well, I talked a lot about it on the campaign trail. I talked a lot about the issue of whether I would take a congressional pension. And that sort of led me into the broader issue of dealing with pensions for members of the House and Senate. But again, I like to emphasize, for me, this is not a matter of a moral judgment. This is simply a matter of what we can afford to do. There was an interesting editorial in the Wall Street Journal today about American Airlines and how the benefit system that they had in place contributed to their bankruptcy. Same with Chrysler, same with General Motors. And if you look at the amount of money involved with congressional pensions, it's relatively small. It's in the millions. But when you get into pensions for the broader civil servants, basically federal employees, you're talking about billions and billions. And in fact, if you fast forward to 2065, you're talking about almost $1 trillion deficit with regard to federal employee pensions.
Here's the story that our guest, Congressman Griffin, is talking about. This is in the editorial page, the opinion section of the Wall Street Journal. The AMR union warning GM Chrysler, for that matter Greece, now add the American Airlines Group, the holding company that runs American and filed for bankruptcy Tuesday, to the growing role of union-induced failures.
I think if you look at that last paragraph, it basically talks about how a lot of the pension systems and benefit systems that are still in place today, both in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere, were fashioned during a different time under different fiscal and different economic circumstances. And as I like to point out, we're not talking about trying to reform or eliminate benefits that most in the private sector get. To the contrary, in the private sector, about 20% of workers get pensions. 80% of public employees get pensions. And what this article points out is if you look at some of these companies, as I mentioned, the pension system was a big part of their financial problems. If you look at what is going on in Europe with Greece and Italy and some of the other countries, particularly in southern Europe, you see that a big driver of some of the fiscal problems is, in fact, the defined benefits that European governments have been giving over the years.
Looking at what's happening in the UK right now, here's a story from USA Today. British workers are staging large strikes. Schools were closed and libraries shuttered across Britain on Wednesday as hundreds of thousands of government workers walked off the job to protest debt-reducing proposals that affect pensions and pay. Is there a danger in gouging too much and going too far?
Well, here's a distinction I think I would make. If you wait too long as a country to deal with your fiscal problems, then the cuts and the changes and reforms that have to be made impact people now relying on them. If you're able to deal with the problem early enough, then you can simply not impact people currently relying on the system and deal with the next generation. For example, my proposal in terms of congressional pensions, and also I have not introduced legislation on federal employee pensions yet, but the discussions that I'm having, generally, I don't impact anybody currently affected. I grandfather in people that are relying on these programs, and that's the right thing to do. So, for example, someone read something about my legislation, and they called up my office and said, don't take away my particular benefit. And what I say is, we're not even talking about anybody currently working for the federal government. What we're talking about is getting ahead of the curve, reforming for the next generation, for the folks that haven't even graduated from college yet or haven't even started working for the federal government. So you're not pulling the rug out from people who are relying on a federal pension, who have built their retirement security around a federal pension, for example. Same with the members of Congress. What we're talking about is grandfather all those people in. They're not impacted. That's a big contrast. They've waited so long in Europe that the changes have to be drastic, and they in Europe have to make changes that impact people now who are currently relying on this. If we get ahead of this, we can reform for the next generation, much like what we proposed in the House on the Medicare issue. We talked about changing Medicare, reforming it so that we can save it. Well, the point that we continually made to people is we're talking about people who are currently on Medicare, about to be on Medicare. Those people will see no changes. Same here with these pensions. If you're in the federal government, this doesn't apply to you. We're talking about saving this for the next generation.
Congressman Tim Griffin is our guest, Arkansas's 2nd District in his freshman term. He serves on the House Armed Services Committee, also Foreign Affairs, and the Committee on Judiciary. Let's get to the phones and hear from Tony on our Democrats line in Atlanta. Good morning.
Hi, good morning.
Welcome.
Good morning.
Hi, Congressman.
Hi, how are you doing? Good morning.
Wonderful, thank you. I do agree with you about reforming the pensions the way they are now. I don't think they're sustainable, and you were right to make reference to Europe. I think that is part of their problem as well. But I have one more question for you, if you'll please answer it for me. How widespread is the problem of congressmen who are what I call insider trading? I mean, I know that's a strong phrase, but they are able to trade based on information that they get, before the general public gets it. Could you please answer that for me?
Sure. I have never had any personal contact with that. The first I had seen it in terms of being a topic of discussion was on, I think, a 60-minute show. I, for better or worse, am not one who has a lot of stocks to trade, and I don't think I've traded once since I've been in office. So this is not something that personally I've had any dealings with, and I certainly don't go around asking my colleagues on a daily basis whether they've been trading stocks. So the first that I had really heard anything in depth about this was through the press, and so I don't know how you would determine how widespread it is. I guess you could take all the financial disclosures a year from now and go through them and see what trade made. It's something that we need to be cognizant of and take a look at and see what we can do to address any concerns that folks have. But I think a lot of members of Congress put their money in trust, and they have other people make those decisions for them. I don't have an issue. I don't have that issue in my personal life just because I don't have a lot of stock.
Should there be legislation that deals with it, that forbids members of Congress from making trades? It can run the gamut. Anything from controlling how they invest to how they trade to how they move money around while they're sitting in Congress.
Sure. I mean, if information's public and it's on the front page of the newspaper, then obviously that's public information. But if there is information that is not public that may impact markets or what have you, I have no problem looking at some sort of reforms that set some guidelines on what you need to do and how you need to do it. I'm fine with that. It doesn't, like I said, it hadn't been a personal issue for me, but I'd be happy to look at that. Absolutely.
Craig, Republican caller in Brigham City, Utah. Good morning.
Good morning to both of you, Congressman. I just returned from Iraq after 8 years, and I'm a little bit appalled, but in 2008, right now the United States has no fiscal balance at all due to the fact that all our imports are coming from China and the rest of them with no money. Plus, our fuel price jumped from $40 a barrel to $140 in 2008 and destroyed every economy in the world. Nobody's ever mentioned that. Now, the reason why everybody's squabbling over money is because we don't have any. And the fact that the oil price is so high, when you look at middle America, everything is tripled transport-wise to get it there. Plus, we have no fiscal balance with our imports and exports. We're basically wasting our time squabbling over what the scraps we have. We have to change that first. And all the rest of it will come into place. Plus, we have NAFTA, which is not working because you got 6 million illegals in the country, so therefore it doesn't work.
Craig, what were you doing in Iraq?
I was a security contractor.
Okay, let's hear from our guest.
Thank you for your question. Thank you for serving in Iraq. You know, I think the broader point that you're making, it seems, is that energy costs have an impact not only on our pocketbooks, but they have energy costs have an impact on our economy in terms of job creators. If a company who hires people has to pay more in energy cost, then they can hire fewer people. If you have to put more of your budget to energy cost, then that takes money away from the other things you could be spending it on. You know, I agree with that. We need to be doing more, it seems. In fact, I know we need to be doing more to be energy independent. And that's why I just am absolutely confused and puzzled by the president's delaying a decision on the Keystone Pipeline. I have a company in the 2nd Congressional District of Arkansas called Wellspun, and they make pipe to be used in the Keystone Pipeline. Now, they have made about 700 miles of pipe already. They have hundreds of employees, want to expand hundreds more, and they are now uncertain about the future of this project. And the president, instead of saying we'll make this decision as soon as we can, he says, well, we'll just make it after the election. That's over a year, you know, it's almost a year away. So I think that's a purely political decision. There are jobs there. We can move toward energy independence if we get creative in terms of the different things we can be doing on energy, drilling more, taking a look at the Canadian oil sands, refining those. You know, I met with some of the leaders at the Canadian Embassy here in Washington, and they said, look, we want to do this deal with you all on the Keystone Pipeline, but if you don't want to do it, we've got to find somebody to refine these oil sands, and we'll go to China.
Congressman Tim Griffin, he served in the U.S. Army Reserve for 14 years. He was deployed to Iraq, and he holds the rank of major. He's our guest this morning, talking primarily about legislation that he's working on that would eliminate the pension benefit offered to members of Congress. Here's how Gordon in Florida weighs in on Twitter. He writes, I guess Representative Griffin doesn't want the best researchers and scientists to work for the government. They'll go to the private sector.
Well, that's just not true. Here's what I would say. That first of all, there was a good study that came out in ABC earlier in the year that shows that on average federal employees make more than the private sector, number one. Number two, most in the private sector don't give pensions. And in fact, the companies in the private sector that give 401ks, that support 401ks for the employees, on average match up to 3%. In the federal government, you get matched up to 5%. Very generous 401k plan. So I know the point he's trying to make, but it just doesn't make sense because the benefits, even if you take away the pension, the benefits in the private sector are still not as generous as the federal government. and that's just a fact. And at the end of the day, you can say what you will, but when you're out of money, you're out of money. No matter what you say, you can't change the fact that 2 + 2 is 4. And I think a lot of the workers who are getting out or are being put out of work in Europe because of what's going on there, I think if they had it to do over and could go back 20, 30 years and change some of these systems so that they don't lead to this place, they'd go back in time and fix it. We still have an opportunity to fix it. I'm trying to help us get there.
What about the argument that if you don't incentivize running for Congress, you only get people who are really wealthy, who can afford to put their finances on hold to work in Congress? Is it important to have incentives for regular folks to run and
Sure.
to feel like they get compensated and they can afford to do it?
Absolutely. I would say a couple of things. First of all, I ran for Congress and I'm not wealthy. I'm not even close to wealthy. And I turned down my pension, number one. Most folks that run for Congress that I know, they didn't run for the pension. They don't go through all of the things that you go through running for office, putting your name out there and all the stuff you have to do. They don't do that so they can get a pension. Most of the people that I know, there may be some that do, but I think they would be rare. Also, again, if it would be different if we were somehow changing something, reforming something, taking away something that the private sector supplies routinely, provides routinely. But we're not. It's not like the alternative in the private sector is so different. In the private sector, these pensions generally are not provided. I think there are plenty incentives to run for office if you want to serve, and we are paid well. We have generous health care benefits, but at the end of the day, this is not about a moral judgment. This is about the fact that we just can't afford. We just can't afford to keep doing this.
Let's look at the numbers. Congressional pensions. As of 2009, members receiving pensions are 455. 275 receive an average of $69,000 a year. 180 receive an average of $40,000 a year. And we're getting those numbers from the Hill Congressional Research Service. Bill joins us from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Independent Line. Welcome.
Yeah, good morning, Congressman.
Yes, sir.
My thought is that the root of the problem is that we have career politicians, the root of our fiscal problem, that is. So the solution would be to go to citizen legislators. And the way to accomplish that would be to amend the Constitution so everybody, whether they're a congressman, senator, or the president, would serve one term and one term only. And in that scenario, there would be no need for a pension. You'd pay them a 401k like with a decent match like you would in the private sector. And also, as far as the congressmen, they vote in how much their pay is. Rather than do that, set it at a percentage of the median income for the nation. So let's say the median income for the nation is $50,000, then the congressional pay maybe would be 200% of median income, and that would be $100,000. And then I think what you do, you'd attract a different type of person that was more interested in public service and less interested in their own gain from the position.
Thank you for your call. I think what you get into there, and again, salaries are a different thing. At some point, you take it so that you're right, as someone here pointed out, you take the salary so low that a lot of folks who would run, that you would want to run, just aren't going to run. But to address the other point you make, first of all, one term of 2 years in the House of Representatives, and you would just be figuring out where some of the rooms are after 2 years, and then you would be gone. I don't think that's a good solution. Just leaving people up here 2 years, I don't think anyone would ever figure out a lot of the complexities, for example, the budget or what have you. I thought I knew a lot about the budget when I ran for Congress. till I got up here. Then I learned how I really knew, and have learned a lot since I got here. On the issue of career politicians, you know, what's interesting to me is when I look at the people who vote particular ways, that work with me on both sides of the aisle and in the Senate, when I look at how they vote, that generally is not based on whether they've been here a long time or not. It's based more on philosophy. So you could have someone who's been here for 30 years or 20 years or 10 years who is a bold reformer, who is conservative, who is really shaking things up or has been trying to shake things up for a long time. You could have someone that just got here this year who's just the opposite. So I know we're looking for ways to fix problems or perceived problems, but I don't think that there's always a correlation between that. But I appreciate your call.
USA Today has in the forum section conservative, liberal minds meeting over common ground. It's if Washington won't change, then let's change Washington. It's time for term limits. So our caller might be interested in that. Let's go to a tweet. Oversight of GOP writes, why not pass Gabby Gifford's bill? This is the Congressional Pay Cut Act. And let's talk about that a little bit. This is coming out of Congresswoman Gifford's office. Here's a story from the Washington Post. While the Congresswoman may not be back to work on Capitol Hill, her influence is still felt in Washington. In a letter to the Debt Reduction Committee organized by Gifford's Washington office, 25 lawmakers urged the supercommittee to cut lawmakers' salaries to reduce the federal deficit. And this is one of the major issues that she pushed before she was injured last January, before she was attacked. So what do you think about that? Well,
we've already, I hear a lot about automatic pay raises back home, and we have frozen pay for members of Congress. I think that at some point, I've given up as I indicated, my pension because Lord willing, I'm going to keep on working if I'm fortunate enough to do that. My grandfather was a minister, and he worked till he was 91. I would hope the Lord blesses me that way. But in any event, you know, so I've given up my pension. I think at some point you deal with the here and now. I could plan for the future. If today, you know, you cut salary in half or something like that, then I think you would find a lot of people that just have to go back to their other jobs. But I think there are a lot of areas that we can cut. We've cut our staffs. We have certainly frozen our salaries. And if you want to make those changes, then advocate for them. But I think you need to make sure that you do like we're proposing, which is you have to give notice so that people can go decide to do something else if they decide to do something else. I mean, you know, if you, as the gentleman proposed, if you said, well, hey, let's make this a 2-year deal, and then you're out and you get paid $50,000 or $100,000 or whatever it is, if you want to make that change, advocate for it. But you got to give people notice so that they can decide to go back home and get a job doing something else. So I think that the issue here, no one is proposing going around the federal government and cutting federal government salaries. That's not what this is about. What this is about is reforming pensions so that in the Congress, so that we can reform pensions within the federal government. And by doing that, you're not just tweaking with a little money as you are with congressional pensions. When you start to deal with federal government pensions, you're talking about hundreds of billions with a B dollars over the coming decades. So that's really what this is about. So it's sort of apples and oranges.
Okay. New York, Harris, Democrats line. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Listen, my name is Harris, and I'm an immigrant from Cuba. Legal immigrant. I've been living in the United States for about 40-something years. I'm proud of you, Congressman, for you renouncing your pension and things like that. I'm very proud of you. And my question is, the immigrant situation about the United States, the illegal immigrant of the United States, I believe that it's about 17 million or something like that, according to what they say. My suggestion, and please bear with me, as a legal immigrant from Cuba, why don't we parole when I'm using the word parole, I'm using it as something like if there's a difference. Like me, I'm a naturalized American citizen, but there's a difference between me and an American-born. I can't run for presidency. Now, let's say somebody that comes from Mexico or from Ecuador comes over to the United States. They are already here 5, 10 years, whatever the situation may be. Why don't we parole that person, make him legal, not with a green card, but hypothetically a red card? That will be his ID. That person will be liable to be a good standard citizen of the United States legally, not looking over his shoulder to be deported, but maybe perhaps that person that instead of 10 people living in one house or 15 people living in one house, not able to purchase, do certain things legally by giving him that parole, and it's a conditional thing for X amount of years or X amount of time, that particular person now is legal to do things that a normal green card citizen is able to do.
Let's get a response, Harris, from our guest, Congressman Griffin.
Thank you for that question. Well, we already have a system in place for giving people legal status that you talk about, but they have to stand in line, not come across the border, swim or run or what have you illegally. If you, because you talked about someone coming up illegally from the south of the border, we already have a system in place, and the difference is you have to stand in line. You have to get in line and follow the rules. I don't think that you say to the people who are following those and standing in line, keep waiting there while we give legal status to people who broke the law to get here. That's not a good way to go. You know, in Iraq and Afghanistan, we spent a lot of money trying to teach people rule of law. Well, this is a rule of law issue here as well. I would say this, there's a lot of opportunity to change immigration law on the legal side. Here, there's a lot of support for some changes, not comprehensive reform as it relates to the border. There's not a lot of an illegal immigration. There's not a lot of agreement on that at this point. But on the issue of legal immigration, I am working on a bill within the confines of the Judiciary Committee, and it relates to STEM graduates, science, technology, engineering, and math. And I hope to be introducing it soon. And basically, what we have now is a situation where we give foreign students who come here to the United States to the best educational system in the world, college education. They'll come over, they'll get a degree, and then when they're done with that degree, a master's, a PhD, or what have you, then they can't get a legal immigration status to stay here, even if they can get a job. And there are a lot of jobs for those people that aren't competing with Americans because we have a shortage of STEM graduates. So what happens? We educate those people, they graduate, and then we tell them, you can't stay to work here and help our country advance. You have to go back home and compete against us. Well, that's like equipping your competitor. So what we say in this bill, again, this is not illegal immigration, this is reforming legal immigration. What we say is, if you come here as a foreign student and you get a master's or a PhD, and I'd like it to be master's and PhD, and some are just advocating for PhDs, but if you come here and you get a degree of that level, at that level in the STEM field, an area where we do not have enough Americans to fill those slots, which is putting us at a competitive disadvantage, if you come here, get that degree, and you can find a job, then we'll keep you here because we want you helping us advance and innovate, not competing against us.
Let's hear from Don in Sanibel, Florida, Republican caller. Welcome.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Hi, Don.
the congressman is dealing with pensions for employees of the government, and I was wondering, does that include military personnel in as much as they are forced to leave their employment at an earlier age than anybody else? So I'll just hang up and listen to the congressman. Thanks.
Well, it does not include military pensions. Does not include military pensions. I think the military is an altogether separate entity. As was mentioned earlier, I not only served in the Army, I'm still in the Army, and I'm going to try to continue to stay in the Army through my congressional service. So no, that is something altogether different. I am on the Armed Services Committee, so that's something that is completely separate.
Email came in and says he applauds you for your stance on not accepting the benefits elected officials are given. Let's look at some of the details and dig into this more about what you want to see happen. Here's an excerpt from a letter sent to the Super Committee. For example, a 5% cut to the $174,000 member salary would save $50 million over a 10-year window, while a 10% pay cut would save $100 million. This is getting that issue of pay versus pensions. Crunch some numbers for us when it comes to pensions.
Sure. Again, and I think this is a critical point. If you stop with just the congressional pensions and you don't go beyond that.
So no pay changes.
No. Well, I mean, if you're not looking at the federal government, civil servant workforce, if you just are looking at what members of Congress get in terms of pensions, you're wasting your time in terms of making a big dent with regard to the deficit and the debt. This is a minuscule percentage of the federal budget. So the next question becomes, well, then why are you doing it? If we stop with congressional pensions, we're not getting very far. Why am I doing it? Because dealing with congressional pensions it's a door, it's a gateway to get to the broader issue of federal employee pensions so that we can reform them. Why do we have to go through congressional pensions first? Because the conversation goes like this. Hey, I'd like to take a look at reforming civil servant pensions. The first retort is, when are you going to do something about yours? So what I say is, take that away. Let's do something about ours. Let's fix our house first. Then, the real point here, the real money here that can help get us on track fiscally. You know, everybody's always saying, well, what would you cut? Well, where would you change? Well, this is not millions. You mentioned millions. Millions is a drop in the bucket. Billions is where the real money is, as they say in Washington. And when you're talking about giving federal employees pensions decade after decade, where they pay in a little bit and the government pays a whole lot, you are talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in the red. So this is simply a step to get to where we need to be. The amount of money that you're talking about here in millions of dollars is not going to impact the deficit or debt the way that the broader billions will.
And how long do you have to serve to get a pension, and how do they?
You vest after 5 years. Now, my understanding is that that's the same 5 that you're required to have if you're a federal employee. Now, I used to be a federal employee, and I already have about 6 years as just a civil servant. And so my understanding is when I started in Congress, what I would have done is immediately started building on what I already had. But again, I want to emphasize to folks, this does not impact any single person. And I'm not talking about my legislation. Obviously, it's just for members of Congress. But the conversation we're having about where we need to go has nothing to do with people currently working for the federal government. This is only the next generation.
John is in Louisville, Kentucky on our Democrats line. Welcome.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My congressman is John Yarmouth. He gives his salary back every year to charity, and I know not everybody can afford to do that, but I think that sets a good example. You know, you talk about these pensions. I think, like when Bush was in, and again when Obama was in, we gave all that huge money to the banks, and I know we give a lot of federal money and contracts to companies, so maybe we could limit the pensions of these guys that are making absorbent amounts of money. What I wanted to say, though, I heard that guy from Pennsylvania call in earlier about term limits, and I'm convinced, because I know Congressman Yarmus talked about it, it's a shame that we've gotten where we are, but I think this congressman's sincere, and I know there's some good people up there, but the game has gotten so out of control. I saw the thing on 60 Minutes about inside trading, which both parties do, by the way, both parties. And I talk to people, Republicans and Democrats. I mean, people are sick of both parties. I hate to say it, but they're literally sick. And I think I would give like 5 2-year terms for congressmen and 2 terms for the Senate, but they have to raise so much money. And look, if I were in office, if somebody gave me $100,000 and somebody else didn't give me money, who are you going to listen to? And by the way, this had changed. I saw a thing. Oh, by the way, I watch that Contenders every Friday night. That's good. But I saw a documentary on Huey Long about a week ago. This was in 1935. He said, well, we voted in one party, then we voted in the other party, so it's always been about money, and I'll listen to your response. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. When I ran, I said that I would just term limit myself to 6 terms, and I've got 2 young kids, and this is tough enough in my first 11 months being up here. But you know, folks talk a lot about the money aspect of it. I'd say a couple things. The people that I work with, you know, you hear a lot of talk about this going on, that going on. I can tell you the folks that I work with day in and day out, particularly the ones I work really closely with, you know, their hearts are in the right place and they're here for good reason. And a lot of them took massive pay cuts to come here, significant pay cuts. And so, yeah, I think what you're talking about it exists. But I think it's the minority in terms of people that are here for to make money or whatever. But let me address this too. There's a lot of misinformation about benefits. There's a lot of misinformation about donations. For example, you said if someone gives somebody else $100,000, it's going to influence this or that. Well, no one can give anybody $100,000. I mean, under the federal rules, an individual can give up to $5,000 per election cycle. Now, I raised in my campaign last time almost $2 million. You know, I have a lot of people that give $1,000 or $2,000 out of $2 million. And, you know, so, but that's for my campaign. It's certainly not for me personally. It, as a percentage of everything that I raise, it's a small amount. So there are limits on what people can give. You know, the folks that I know, they're standing for what they stand for because they ran on it, because they believe in it, and they think it's important. A lot of the whether it be the disagreements, the gridlock, or what have you, it's not because someone was given money. It's because people have fundamentally different visions of where this country ought to go. And if we had a different system, and I don't want a different system, but if we had a parliamentary system, then you have things just flying through all the time with little or no disagreement, because you win the election, the prime minister picks the cabinet and sets the legislative agenda and just rolls on through. But I don't like that system, and the founders didn't like that system. The founders said, we're not going to give anybody a ton of power. We're going to spread it around. We'll give a little bit to the House, give a little bit to the Senate, give the president power, and you got to get agreement. And if you don't get agreement, nothing happens. Well, you can call it gridlock, you can call it what you want. The founders liked it. The founders didn't trust government action to come easily. And so it's frustrating for me. We pass a lot of stuff. We've had over 800 votes in the House. And we pass stuff, and it goes over and stacks up like cordwood in the Senate. So it's frustrating for me. I tell folks back home, if you're frustrated, I'm frustrated. I fly up here, spend a week dealing with this frustration up close and personal. So I feel the same frustration, but at the core of it, it's not about the money. It's not about a lot of this other stuff. The core of what's on is there are two fundamentally different views of where this country ought to be going.
Mike, Republican in Wilmington, North Carolina. Good morning.
Yes, thank you for taking my call. Congressman, I want to applaud you on the stance that you have taken. And I would like for you to address an issue that is not only near and dear to my heart, but the Republican base that I'm from in the North Carolina area, we're highly conservative. We see a growing anger of the American people at the federal government, at all governmental levels, because of what's going on. Being, as I said, conservative Republican, we were taught, I was raised to believe that you live within your means. We don't see that happening. And I can only see the anger building more and more towards our government. I would like you to comment on that because I've not heard anyone bring this issue up before.
Let's leave it there and get a response.
Thank you. There are a lot of people that feel your anger and frustration, and a lot of them are actually serving in Congress. I can tell you this, if we would have passed a balanced budget amendment in the mid-90s, we wouldn't have the debt that we have today. There are a lot of us up here who have voted to live within our means. I voted for cut, cap, and balance to move us toward living within our means and a balanced budget. I voted for the balanced budget amendment. I voted for the House budget, which takes decades to get to balance, but moves us there and gets us on a sustainable path. And even taking decades to get to balance was called extreme and has been called extreme by folks who have run ads against me and what have you. So there are a lot of people up here that want to live within our means. We are voting to do that, but the majority in the Senate and the president have a different vision. All the president needed to do was start this year by saying, hey, there's a bipartisan debt commission. Let's start with those ideas and work with the Republicans and let's get this stuff fixed. But he totally ignored his own commission and proposed an even bigger budget. So some people are serious about it, some people aren't, and we've got to get more people who are serious about living within our means, and we'll get it changed.
Representative Tim Griffin representing Arkansas's 2nd District as a Republican, that's the Little Rock area, in his freshman term. Thank you so much for being here this morning.
Enjoyed it. Appreciate it.
Coming up next, a discussion with Congressman Earl Blumenauer about year-end spending and tax battles. But first, a news update from C-SPAN Radio.